Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 35th week of 2018. I'm Carl Estabrook. Historians consider a generation to be about 25 years, the time it takes for you to get to the age your parents are now. For more than a generation, this program has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Earlier editions of this program are available at archive.org. Our program's name, News from Neptune, comes from Noam Chomsky, who's been writing sensible things about U.S. politics for more than twice as long as we've been on the air. Chomsky says that in the U.S. media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true and you'll sound like you're from Neptune. Tonight, David Green and I will try to say some true things, with thanks to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, for research. No's notes are posted on the News from Neptune Facebook page. We try to bear in mind the murdered Rosa Luxemburg's remark from a century ago: the most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening. This is a Celebrate U.S. Ethics edition. The little university down the street is giving an ethics award to a child killer next week, another indication, were it necessary, of the perversity of both the presidency and the academy. David and I will begin tonight with lists of topics from the week's news. And David, if you're ready, go ahead.
Well, I guess a list is anything more than two. I don't know. Maybe I've got three or four things.
That's interesting. My lists are getting longer and yours are getting shorter. Are getting shorter.
Well, there's a list in my head. I haven't written all that much down. There's a lot going on, of course. But sort of like to see how things go, and I'll draw on some things. But, of course, what's dominating the news, and really shouldn't be, is the death of John McCain, and the manner in which this is being treated by the media and the kind of political culture. For some strange reason, I've been thinking about Bob Dole. He's still alive at age 95.
Uh-huh.
And at least as of the last time I checked. And I was thinking McCain and Dole are kind of similar figures in certain ways. I don't think Dole was as blatantly self-aggrandizing as McCain was. They both ran for president and lost. They were both veterans who were injured and whose injuries in war sort of gave them a certain cred in the political system as it operates. Dole wasn't nearly as crass as McCain in McCain's chicanery that goes all the way, his political chicanery going all the way back to the Keating Five sort of real estate frauds in Arizona in the 1980s, and from there moving forward, never opposed any wars. He claims to have opposed torture, but it's doubtful that he actually did in any substantive way during the era post-2001, in which torture moved to the front of the agenda about how we should treat prisoners. All this has been, you could find many articles in Counterpunch and elsewhere sort of debunking the myth, the McCain legend. But in spite of that, everybody who's anybody is in Washington to pay their final respects. Obama himself is going to, before he gets around to coming here later this week or next week, I guess it's next Saturday or Sunday?
Friday or Saturday, I think.
Friday or Saturday. Mm-hmm. He's gonna do something, because this is what you got to do in our bipartisan, in our two wings of the same bird of prey political party system that we have here. And the New York Times news story about what's going on in Washington up to the moment kind of captures this sense of the manner in which the media plays this. Just a little prose, a little typical New York Times prose here. Prominent Republicans and Democrats are flocking to the Capitol to pay their respects to Mr. McCain, highlighting both his own style of reaching across the political aisle and the brand of politics whose demise he lamented in the final months of his life. What that brand of politics is whatever brand of politics Donald Trump is challenging in his strange way. That's from me, not from the New York Times. Mr. McCain
Yes.
painstakingly planned the observances of his death. That reminds one of Ronald Reagan, who also, he and his wife, Nancy, also painstakingly planned the circumstances of his death and the manner in which the funeral and burial would play out, whenever that happened, 2004 or 5. Mr. McCain painstakingly planned in the observances of his death in the months preceding it, in part to underscore his message of unity over division and implicit rebuke to the president, Trump, with whom he disagreed vehemently, both politically and stylistically. That's kind of a strange thing. Vice President Joseph R. Biden, here we're getting quote-unquote bipartisan. Vice President Joseph R. Biden eulogized Mr. McCain at his funeral in Phoenix on Thursday, and President Barack Obama will do so on Saturday at a memorial service in National Cathedral in Washington, where President George W. Bush will also speak. Mr. Pence, who unlike Mr. Trump is known for staying on message, that's Vice President Pence, when in the spotlight, is likely to keep the proceedings from veering into partisan territory. This language is, but do not expect the pause to last too long. Hearings on Mr. Kavanaugh's, the Supreme Court nominee's, confirmation are scheduled for next week. So that's New York Times speak. It goes on and on about Pence and about how Pence saw eye to eye with Trump in various ways, and they worked together. And the only other sort of comment I wanted to make, in case you didn't notice, Carl, in the New York Times, there's a strange article, kind of surprising, by the very good writer and analyst Pankaj Mishra, who wrote an article titled "The Religion of Whiteness Becomes a Suicide Cult." Subtitle, "A Wounded and Swaggering Identity Geopolitics Puts the World in Grave Danger." This isn't something I would have associated with Pankaj Mishra, who's been writing some very good stuff, book-length stuff, as well as long-form articles in the London Review of Books, including a critique of, I think, Ta-Nehisi Coates and and sort of really taking down the Obama sort of mythos. But here he sort of buys into the notion of the fundamental power, which we've referred to on this program before, of white supremacism as it's allegedly coming up through the Trump era, and there's been a lot lately even on left-wing websites, including the Counterpunch newsletter, that kind of reviews the history of white supremacism in scientific garb, going back to the 1800s into the early part of the 19th century or early part of the 20th century in this country, what with all the racial theories that accompanied us closing ourselves off to basically closing the doors to immigrants in 1924. But it doesn't seem to, the idea that these were elite theories. These were theories made by elite scientists, academics and quote unquote scholars of various ways in the early days of sociology, anthropology, political science, and so forth, accompanied by this sort of social Darwinism, this post-Darwin social Darwinism applied in unfortunate ways to applying Darwin's evolutionary theories and theories of the survival of the fittest to political and social phenomenon, to understanding history and so forth, which continues to the present day to a certain extent. And anyway, what I wanted to say there was I don't quite get what's going on here in terms of understanding what's happening at a popular level, applying these theories and referring to some of these elite people and theorists and applying their theories as if common people, ordinary people, understand these theories or are using these theories, and as if this is going on in some way that we can analyze apart from the usual material class understanding of what's going on. It's the same thing week after week. I feel like I'm repeating myself, but we've got to get down to this material understanding of the relation of capitalism, the relationship, production, and all this, and this veering off. And I'm surprised to see Pankaj Mishra kind of doing that in a rather unqualified way.
Thank you, David. There are a number of things, obviously, we can spin out of these observations. The first one I would like to do is a paragraph that Jeffrey Sinclair wrote on Counterpunch about John McCain. He said, after a week of media fawning, flags racing up and down staffs, and memorials coast to coast, John McCain will finally be laid to rest this weekend in Annapolis, and amid eulogies from George W. Bush and Barack Obama. Give McCain some credit for using the occasion of his funeral to illustrate vividly that there's less than a dime's worth of difference between the politicians of our time. I'm only surprised that McCain's final will and testament didn't follow the Caesarian tradition, the tradition of Julius Caesar, and call for 7 days of war games as part of this memorial. The best protest Trump could make against this prolonged McCain-gasm is not to drone anyone this week. The image of McCain as some kind of freewheeling political contrarian was, of course, almost entirely the creation of the press corps that is now weeping over his corpse. McCain was no Cicero. His jokes, barbs, and long-winded floor speeches were largely for show. When it came time for voting, on matters ranging from war in Iraq to apartheid in South Africa, McCain was an unvarnished creature of the far right. Politically, he wasn't far removed from the senatorial savages of our time, Jesse Helms, Trent Lott, and Dick Armey. Those spitting cobras have been rightly consigned to a kind of historical detention for their racism and warmongering, but McCain has been almost universally venerated, largely because he knew that the easiest way to manipulate the press was to preen for the cameras and give them an occasional pat on the head. As a parting shot, here in the current issue of Counterpunch is the last piece Alexander Coburn and I, Jeffrey Sinclair, wrote on McCain for the print edition of Counterpunch shortly after he blew what should have been a sure thing against Barack Obama in 2008. And I recommend the article that follows that on the website counterpunch.org for a good contemporary account of who and what this war criminal John McCain actually was.
That was actually the most revealing part of that article for me, in terms of I really hadn't gotten through to me, I'm not sure if then or now or since, that McCain should have defeated Obama, or could have defeated Obama with a few proper strategic choices in 2008, because in retrospect I admit to sort of feeling, if you'd asked me, I thought, well, Obama kind of had it sewed up and there was no reason he should have lost. And what Sinclair goes into there, what was kind of revelatory a little bit to me, was the fact that McCain could have won by opposing the bailouts of Wall Street in 2008, while Obama was busy caving in because
Exactly.
people were very angry about
Yep,
that.
that's quite right.
And in fact, it was a popular uprising exactly 10 years ago at this point, September, I think it was,
Right.
in 2008, which basically halted the Congress's, a popular uprising through phones and emails and whatever,
Right.
sent a very strong message to congresspersons: do not vote for this bill. And they had to put it off for a while until they could kind of finesse it through with the proper whatever transpired during that month or two.
That's quite right, and I recommend the full article on McCain amidst all the nonsense that's being written about McCain that you will read elsewhere. You're listening to News from You're watching News from Neptune. We are following our procedure of listing topics at the top of the show and talking about them as time allows. I have 10 topics that somehow have grown into 14 or 15. So I will try to do them quickly. Number one, Monsanto lost a lawsuit in which we have a court finding that glyphosate is carcinogenic. This is quite remarkable and very serious for the country at large, as Monsanto and other chemical companies continue to cover the food that we eat. Number two, DPRK, that is North Korea, slams the U.S. for hatching a criminal plot to unleash war against Pyongyang. Frankly, it's hard to believe anyone from the DPRK would believe the U.S., given how many times the U.S. has lied to them. The particular form of the current lies have more to do with Trump's untraditional, put it that way, peace overtures to North Korea and the horror with which they have been greeted by the political establishment in the U.S. Trump being perhaps the weakest American president since Calvin Coolidge, it's no surprise that the political establishment is making its writ run on this matter. 3. Chomsky, Greenwald, Boris Johnson of Britain, and others, a remarkable list of others, are said to be Assadists, supporters of the president of Syria, Assad. Now, when this is the sort of discussion that's going on in the political press, it's hardly surprising that most Americans really are not aware of what's happening around the world.
Who's calling them that besides Louis Project?
Big pardon?
Who's calling them that besides Louis Project?
Well, whoever put together this list of the dangerous Assadists, I don't think it was all Louis' fault, but I'm sure he helped.
Okay.
Number 4, the problems of security on the internet is a topic that our crack researcher, Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, has been eloquent about. And he writes this week, you can see the notes on our Facebook page, about VPNs, virtual private networks. And he quotes a document, an article for the internal NASA news site SID Today. This is what the government is doing in watching you. Quote, although VPNs pose special challenges for SIGINT, you've got to learn how to talk this language, signals intelligence is meant, collection and processing, we've, that he's talking about the NSA, have recently had notable success in exploiting these communications. So if you think your communications are secure, you're wrong. Number 5, the list is long here. Is it because the Democrats and Republicans look so much alike? Last week, we mistakenly referred to Ron Wyden, senator from Oregon.
Don't say we, you.
And you pointed out my error. Yes, I appreciate it.
I'm not part of this we.
We in this case means Dr. No and I referred to him as a member of the Republican Party. Also, to share honors here, my friend,
Yeah.
James Bennett, the editorial editor of the New York Times.
I got that one wrong.
You got that. Is actually
I noticed that this week.
the brother of Michael Bennett,
Yeah.
a Republican senator from the state of Utah, not Colorado, as someone said here last week. Right?
Did I say Colorado?
You did.
And actually, is he Democrat or Republican? Actually, I think he's Democrat also.
No, in
I
fact,
thought he was, but
I think
anyway.
he is a Republican. I
Okay,
think you were right about
you're
that.
right.
But
Okay, being half right.
okay.
Yeah.
There's been an awful lot made, point 6, an awful lot made, I think, of some finally quite unobjectionable remarks by Noam Chomsky on Democracy Now! About the autocratic Nicaraguan government and his call for new elections by the Ortega regime in Nicaragua. This has been seen as scandalous by some on the left in this country, and I think what it testifies to is, frankly, an ignorance of what happened in Nicaragua after the Sandinista revolution and the effective reversal of that revolution by the U.S. and the acceptance of that reversal by Daniel Ortega, the long-term president of Nicaragua. It's an important topic that I think is being very badly treated in the media, and one we perhaps should talk more about here. Point 7, Israeli border guard Ben Derry's sentence is doubled to 18 months after video reveals an unarmed 17-year-old Palestinian was no immediate threat to him, but he killed him. The story of what's happening in this amazing demonstration in Gaza still is far less known in this country than it should be. Number 8, Congress swore that its Dodd-Frank reform of the banking system was only intended to benefit put-upon community banks and credit unions. Now that it's become law, they don't need to pretend anymore. They're working for the usual people, the big banks. Number 9, Facebook gave conflicting reasons why they censored Telesurf's English page and reinstated it 2 days later. In fact, it's part of the overt hostility of the U.S. government, Facebook acting as its agent, against the only major news outlet in Latin America that doesn't toe the U.S. line, that is Telesur. Let's see, where are we? Number 10. Glenn Greenwald has written a nice talk, or has participated in a nice talk with Chomsky on the perennial 21st century theme, they hate us for our freedoms, trying to understand why there's resistance to American military domination of the rest of the world. I'll put that on the Facebook page too and recommend it. President Trump's Space Force is a little more of the reorganization of the Air Force along lines that they've been talking about for a long time. But it brings up the question of the military budget that the Trump administration put forward. And a lot of people use the military budget, outrageous as it is. The increase in the military budget is greater than the entire Russian military budget. People bring that up as an example of the warmongering of the Trump administration or of Trump himself, in contrast with all that peaceable activity we had from Barack Obama, the only president to be at war through 2 presidential terms. In fact, it's necessary at least to note that there is a distinction between warmongering, making war, and a military budget. One does not necessarily imply the other. the military budget has, since the Great Depression in the U.S., been a primary method of stimulating the economy. Military Keynesianism, as it's been called, with reference to Keynes' notion of how a government should produce a healthy economy. Military Keynesianism is bound up with the Trump administration's increase in the military budget and the Republican Congress's increase in the military budget. And indeed, if you look at the figures recently about American economic performance overall, it's clearly had an effect. The problem is the effect hasn't helped the people who needed help, that is, the majority of the American population whose immiseration produced Trump in the first place. It's helped Wall Street very well. It's helped the defense contractors, one of the greatest euphemisms of contemporary politics. We're talking about people who make bombs and need to sell more of those bombs to the U.S. government and other appropriate governments. And the military Keynesianism of the military budget is, in fact, in some ways, in contrast to the actual use of these materials abroad, or they come from different motives, and those motives should be distinguished.
But it should also be said that the increased deficits and the whole phony talk about deficits, federal deficits, and how horrible they are, that feeds into that and makes excuses. Makes it the conventional wisdom that other programs need to be cut,
yes,
which in fact they were.
Which is what they're meant to do.
In fact, they have been. So
right. That's very
Trump
true. And indeed, what we should do
is discredit for that also. Trump administration.
But what we should do is take the blinders off and say, well, that means we should cut the military budget. Perhaps it does, but that's not the issue. The point is that we should spend money on things that are worthwhile. The government should spend money on things that are worthwhile, up to and including what is emerging as a remarkable cross-party agreement in many places that the U.S. needs a guaranteed annual income, that a uniform basic income is necessary for Americans. That's being talked about elsewhere as well. There are even experiments with this in various places. But if we have any luck, that may be a serious issue as opposed to all the unserious issues in the next presidential campaigns. A couple of cases involving Russia that people need to be aware of. One involved Maria Butina, an accused Russian agent, is really an NRA lobbyist and gun enthusiast, student at American University, and as the government has got on her case as part of the Russiagate hysteria, even more the case of Reality Winner, who has been sent to jail for 5 years plus on the grounds of the same Russiagate nonsense. Both of these cases need to be known because of what they show about what the U.S. government is doing. It's no accident the last American president used the Espionage Act from the First World War, from the Wilson administration, that had little to do with spying and espionage and a great deal to do with criticism of government policies. The Obama administration used that act against whistleblowers and others more than all the administration since the wretched administration of Woodrow Wilson, and got away with it. The Trump people are following up. Point 13. Russiagate again. The Atlantic magazine, which is a shameful piece of propaganda usually. Claims Russia will somehow meddle to subvert American democracy again in the upcoming midterm elections in a three-step plan. 1. Cyber attacks against U.S. election systems. 2. Buying favor by purchasing the votes of corrupt U.S. politicians, what a thought. And 3. By supporting Putin-friendly U.S. political candidates. It'd be easy to pick these people out, right? I mean, they're obviously spies. This is the Atlantic's take on Russiagate this week. Point 14, the Julian Assange vigil. The imminent suppression of the asylum of Julian Assange in London has led to demonstrations in Britain and elsewhere, very few in the U.S., because, of course, Assange suppression is supported by leading Democrat liberals like our own senior senator and most of the rest of the political establishment in this country. Elsewhere in the rest of the world, the matter is more clearly seen, and there have been demonstrations there, and even some in this country. And I did say that I stopped at 15.
If you stop at 14, then we could at least call you Wilsonian in some
Well,
sense.
exactly. The 14 points have been stuck in my head, I think, for a while here. But I do have 15. This is, in fact, based on an article written by an ex-student of mine in the Wall Street Journal. U.S. corporate profits boomed in the second quarter, boosted by large tax cuts and stronger economic growth than initially reported, and also, of course, by the military budget we've been talking about. Theo Francis, the Wall Street Journal, reports the Commerce Department said that its broadest measure of after-tax profits across the U.S. rose 16.1% in the quarter ending June 30th from a year earlier, the largest year-over-year gain in 6 years. Teo's journalistic career has been devoted to the question of corporate profits and CEO compensation, and this material can be relied on. Finally, I've got to mention, after starting with Jeff Sinclair on John McCain, I've got to mention the wonderful C.J. Hopkins, who has another article in Counterpunch today that will lift your spirits if you read it. He is an illustration of the point that I've suggested for years, that the poets often get there first. Hopkins is a poet and a playwright, and writes brilliantly about the resistance in American politics right now. Don't miss it. Okay, there's my list.
I wanted to mention, along with, if you're reading the Counterpunch, this morning's Counterpunch or the weekend Counterpunch list, an article by a woman named Ann Garrison called "In the Year of the Pig: The Real
Yes.
Vietnam War Heroes." And it's about a movie that maybe I've heard of, but I have not seen, but that is available for watching just on YouTube. And let me just read an excerpt of her article. "I'll be glad if I never hear John McCain's name again, but his death made me look back and try once more to understand the U.S. war with the Vietnamese People's Army, whose anti-aircraft gunners shot him out of the sky during his 23 bombing raids over North Vietnam," obviously the last of those 23 bombing raids. On the KPFA Radio Sunday show, Kevin Alexander Gray, who also writes on Counterpunch, said, "The national mourning for John McCain is almost a referendum or a recasting of the Vietnam War, where every soldier is a hero, even though they were fighting in wars they had no business fighting in. Everybody's a hero," close quote for Kevin Alexander Gray. And Garrison goes on, "I don't think everybody's a hero, quote unquote, least of all bomb Iran John McCain, but I hugely admire the soldiers who ended the Vietnam War by refusing to fight, and even fragging, shooting or throwing grenades at the commanders, urging them on. The anti-war movement at home supported those heroes, but they were the ones who made it impossible to continue the war. They told their story in the documentary film Sir, No Sir. I felt," and then she goes on, Ann Garrison goes on, "I felt for the wounded foot soldiers writhing in agony in the final moments of Emile D'Antonio's brilliant Vietnam War documentary, In the Year of the Pig. And I felt angry at the politicians and anti-communist ruling class who sent them off to suffer and die. I hadn't watched In the Year of the Pig for nearly 20 years, but it's one of the most profound films I've seen about the USA's Vietnam War, so I watched it again, and I recommend it to anyone reading this. Emile D'Antonio doesn't narrate the film, it's simply his composition of documentary footage. It's also one of the few documentaries made while the war was going on. The other most famous documentary would have been made by Peter Davis's Peter Davis's movie about documentary film about the Vietnam War, and the name strangely escapes me right now. It'll come back to me.
Me too. It'll come to me. I know what you mean.
Yeah, yeah. But anyway, so and then so there are just a couple of notes from the Israeli analysis front of a media nature. Norman Finkelstein continues to write good stuff in response to the Corbyn, to the ridiculous, almost as ridiculous as the Russiagate business, or really as ridiculous as the Russiagate business. He had written an article defending Corbyn and the Labour Party against charges of anti-Semitism and so forth. And his latest article, which is on Mondoweiss, is also in relation to that, but it's in relation to the definition of anti-Semitism as it's supposedly being applied in Britain. And he, in his both philosophical and polemical style, really takes this apart, going back to his references to John Stuart Mill and people like that really provide a good grounding for that. And also a person I've been referring often lately to on this program, Shir Hever, who's been interviewed on the Real News Network, was interviewed earlier this week on the occasion of a statement by the leader of Hezbollah, Nasrallah, regarding the fitness or lack of fitness of Israeli soldiers. And I found that very insightful in terms of understanding what's going on in the supposed people's military of Israel right now, who's in it, why they're having why in a allegedly universal conscription situation there, why only less than 50% of people actually are going into the military at this time, how they're getting out, why they're getting out, and what the implications of that for any future wars, real wars that Israel might choose to fight. So
the film we were both trying to think of is Peter Davis' Hearts and Minds.
Hearts and Minds.
Right. Mm-hmm. No, these are very worthwhile, and these are not. This is not just recherche musings by elderly gentlemen. They may be exactly that, but they may be that, but there's something more. Particularly when you pick up your News Gazette a couple of times a week and see a feature, usually on the front page, entitled "Those Who Served." And it's about the stories of local veterans from Iraq and even from Vietnam. And they remind me always of the late George Carlin's remark, service is a funny word for killing people. And the attempt by features like this in the public press are to sanitize the wars that the United States has carried on to maintain its economic hegemony in our lifetimes. These wars have killed 20 million people by relatively conservative estimate in almost 40 nations since the end of the Second World War. And the history of those events has had to be mythologized and propagandized terribly for most Americans. People are not fools. People know when crimes are being committed. And the greatest propaganda system in history, the U.S. media, has worked overtime to make sure that people think that these are glorious crusades carried on by the United States in search of freedom and justice for the world at large. That was nonsense during the Cold War. It's nonsense now. And it's even more serious in some ways now as the U.S. fights desperately to maintain the economic hegemony that it found itself possessed of at the end of the Second World War, being the only undamaged major country from that war. Relatively speaking, as other countries revived after the war and continued to develop, particularly in Asia, in the last generation, the American empire is not crumbling, but it is declining relatively. And that relative decline sends American politicians around the world in search of material ways to make sure that that relative decline does not continue, because that relative decline means threats to the profits of the American 1%, and that's not to be allowed. So we have such things as 8 wars around the world being conducted by the present administration. They inherited from the last one. I'm never quite sure what that means to say that an administration inherits wars because they don't have to keep doing it, right? And the situation of the United States and the world at large is to be exactly what Martin Luther King called it many years ago, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. That has to be covered over for Americans. Americans, as I say, are not fools and are not murderers either, but their government is.
So during the Vietnam War, all these taboos against criticizing, well, it's complicated, but you know, given this business about the soldiers rebelling in the Vietnam War, allowed the kind of criticism of the wars, and took the debate away from just talking about whether we're criticizing our soldiers and not supporting our troops. I mean, back then, nobody talked about supporting the troops. They talked about supporting the war. They at least had to defend in the media supporting those wars. But here, the News Gazette's strategy is to not even talk about the wars, not even really cover the wars in any serious way, in spite of the News Gazette's editors' alleged beliefs in limited government and the government shouldn't be spending so much money. We can't talk about these past wars. We can't talk about these current wars. We simply put these veterans out there, usually people that have come through the war in relatively safe circumstances, not always, but they survived the war, obviously. They weren't so damaged by the war. There might have been one story about someone who admitted that having been in the military had given him problems later in life that we've become accustomed to talking about. But mostly sanitizing. Oh, I thought the war wasn't. That was kind of fun, and it was kind of daring, and it was kind of heroic, and it was kind of crappy, and it was kind of boring, but I got on with my life, blah, blah, blah. And to extol the virtues of these people. But what I'm trying to get at here with all this verbiage is, how do we go about puncturing that? How do we go about challenging that? I mean, I could sit down and write a letter saying what I think about what's going on here, okay? But I don't want to do it in a way that's only going to provoke the sort of visceral reaction that I've provoked in the past, for sure, like when I criticized flyovers of football games back 8 or 9 years ago. In fact, it was around this time of year in 2010 that I got into trouble, into big trouble for doing that. But still, week after week, these articles go by, and nobody ever responds to them because there's plenty of people who see what's going on there, but nobody will say anything about what the real agenda of this series, of this Those Who Serve series is.
I wrote the reporter who was responsible for the last.
Well, but it's always Paul Wood, right? I think he's been responsible for everyone.
And received an acknowledgement of my letter.
Did.
So, I mean, who do you think you are, David Colin Kaepernick here? I mean, complaining about football games? What is this? Just because a lot of people died?
I don't know who I think I am, but I mean, whoever I think I am, I've been for the last 20 years, 25 years. Feeling like I'm sort of this dissident character. And I understand what it's like to not be a dissident character, because I wasn't always this way. But it's pretty clear, it should become pretty clear how things work if you sort of keep at it and are honest with what's going on and honest with yourself and, don't mind admitting you were wrong about certain things, or not even wrong, but just uninformed about certain things. And I don't understand why more people aren't aren't informed about certain things. But I think there's a kind of bullying aspect of this
Oh, yes.
that is sort of just to provoke people into silence. Like, well, if you say you don't support the veterans, if you say, well, this person who served doesn't seem like they had a very conscientious understanding of what they were getting into in, say, going into the Vietnam War, and I don't think they should be honored for that. You just don't. These things just can't be said, and we're supposed to remain. They can't be said. They can be said. They're supposed to remain silent. But what you're going to get if you point it out in anything but the most delicate way is just this sort of backlash. And the mainstream media isn't going to rescue you. They'd probably print my letter, but
They didn't print my last one.
Yeah, they didn't print your last one, but
No, they didn't print my last one.
Well, they probably will, but
Well, I sent them a second copy, so we'll see if.
But anyway, I mean, these are the kind of things I think about in terms of how to approach, because I think this is something that our liberal friends go along with in a pretty passive way.
I'm afraid that's true. Tell the truth and shame the devil, as Hotspur says, and that's our job here, to do what we can. You made an important point that's worth mentioning. You made a number of important points, but there was one that I would like to highlight from
more than one
that seems to me is frequently ignored and is central to the discussion of the Vietnam War for people who think that's still relevant to American politics, and that's the fact that American ground troops were withdrawn from Vietnam in 1973, and the draft ended for one very important reason. The American Army in Vietnam revolted. That's not in the history books. That's not in the account that most people have of the Vietnam War. They hear about hippies and protesters and maybe even the Democratic Convention in '68 and so forth, but they don't understand, most people don't understand, because it's been covered over so successfully by the American media, that what ended the American ground participation, the flying like John McCain's continued, what ended American ground participation was a revolt of the draftees, a revolt of the soldiers that the U.S. had sent to Vietnam. You mentioned that, up to and including the fragging of officers. And if you don't know what the word fragging means, that's also a tribute to the sort of control that the media exercise in this matter. But the history of Vietnam had to be thoroughly mythologized and propagandized from the mid-1970s to, say, the election of Barack Obama, who used that in his election run. And it's fake. It's false. It's as fake as the American account of the Cold War was. And it's the job of those of us who have the leisure to read and write and think and talk to correct the record here, the record which has immediate political effects in the belligerence of the U.S. government today. And it's the support that the government receives from the populace. You're watching News from Neptune. We're talking about a wide range of events having to do with American policy, American government policy. Oh, yes. You have. I have something that I wanted to mention here.
Why don't you do something, then I'll do something.
Okay, I'll do something. There's an article by Francis Fukuyama that is quite remarkable. It appears this week. Fukuyama, if you don't remember, his name is, in spite of his Japanese name, is an American political scientist and philosopher, really, who a generation ago wrote a book called The End of History. And the book argued that, look, history has been working to try to produce liberal society, a liberal economy, the sort of thing that the U.S. has finally achieved in the 20th century, and out of its beneficence spread it around to the rest of the world. The result is the American empire. A lot of people wondered whether Fukuyama was quite serious. A lot of people wondered whether Fukuyama was correct in talking about the end of history. We've reached the form of human society that's appropriate to human beings, and we shouldn't screw around with it. But Fukuyama himself has now decided that he was wrong. That it's not the case that the end of history had been reached. And one of the principal indications, or one of the principal reasons for this, is, of all things, identity politics. Now, I've argued here that the real story about identity politics says a great deal about American political action since the Vietnam War, American government action since the Vietnam War, and the propaganda cover that's been offered to it. We can't go into all those details here. Don't urge me, because I might. But Fukuyama says that the recognition struggles, that's what he calls it, of identity politics flow out of the social movements that began to emerge in the 1960s involving African Americans, women, the LGBT community, Native Americans, and disabled. These groups found a home on the left, triggering a reaction on the right. They say, what about us? Aren't we deserving of recognition? Haven't the elites ignored us, downplayed our struggle? That's the basis of today's populism. Now, Fukuyama isn't stupid, but he is very good at misleading people about what's going on. What he wrote there is nonsense. The basis of today's populism is 40 years of neoliberalism that has produced a massive and accelerating increase in inequality in America, austerity in Europe. In 21st century, in a study of this, populism has been accurately described as an ideology that pits a virtuous and homogeneous people against a set of elites and dangerous others who are together depicted as depriving or attempting to deprive the sovereign people of their rights, values, prosperity, identity, and voice. And that's a much better account of the populist wave, which is real, that Fukuyama wants to reduce to a Hegelian study for Hegelian demand for recognition, rising in the 1960s, and we know how foolish the 1960s were. So Fukuyama goes back on his end of history notion only to condemn the notion of populism, which is in fact far more serious and far more materially based than the ideas that he excoriates in his new book.
Yeah, that actually sort of connects in a strange way to what I wanted to refer to, which is the fact that our friend Karen Aram wanted us to listen to a debate on a NPR program called Intelligence Squared, or something that's I think promoted through NPR, perhaps other outlets. And what this debate was a question. It's one of these yay or nay debate kind of things, and the proposition put forward for debate is China and the U.S. are long-term enemies, and so arguing in favor of the fact that they're long-term enemies, that's just the way it is the noted political scientist, probably well known to Francis Fukuyama, John Mearsheimer of the University of Chicago, the realist political scientist, the international relations analyst. I watched or listened to about half of this. You don't have to watch it; it's just people talking, and what I learned was that, again, how this relates is, again, that the question of whether we're long-term enemies seems to be detached from the question of whether we're long-term capitalists, whether here or in China. And I think at least what was a little bit interesting about this is, of course, the blatant way in which it's assumed that this is the correct question to be asking, whether we're long-term enemies, as opposed to why anyone would think that and what could be done about it, and how it is that people want to think of China in this way. Arguing for the nay, there was two people arguing for each perspective, but one of the people arguing for nay was somebody I didn't know much about, even though he was the former Australian Prime Minister, named Kevin Michael Rudd, born in 1957, 26th Prime Minister of Australia from 27 to 2010, and again for a while in 2013, the way these things work in parliamentary politics. And he was basically arguing that people have agency in international politics, and choices can be made, and we need to understand what those choices are. And what he argued in arguing that we don't necessarily have to see China, the Western countries don't have to see China as an enemy, is up to the leaders of that country, of these various countries and their policies. But that doesn't quite get at the idea of why it is that, in a very way, in capitalism, where leaders of our countries are forced to see China in this way, and why, in fact, China is forced to sort of adapt to that reality. So, thank you, Karen, I guess, and and so what Kevin, for better or worse, what Kevin Rudd put forward in opposing Mearsheimer was, he defined Mearsheimer's work as determinist realism, where he defined his own idea as constructive realism. So,
more of this anon.
Yeah.
You've been watching News from Neptune for the 35th week of 2018, the last day of the anniversary month of two great crimes of the 20th century, the U.S. atomic attacks on civilians in two Japanese cities after the war was won. The point was to kill enough people to deter Russia and proclaim U.S. hegemony over the Asia-Pacific. Not surprisingly, that remains a cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy today, while the U.S. economic empire fights relative decline. News from Neptune was presented by Carl Estabrook and David Green, produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Ethan Young and Andrew Scolleray. This has been a Celebrate U.S. Ethics edition. The little university down the street is giving an ethics award to a child killer next week, another indication, were it necessary, of the perversity of both the presidency and the academy. Our thanks to Research Director Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, the third man on News from Neptune. No's notes are posted on the Facebook page for News from Neptune. There's an anti-war demonstration tomorrow in downtown Champaign from 2 to 4 p.m. at Main and Neal Street, sponsored by the Aware Group. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere from The Tempest, what's past is prologue, what to come, and yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.